Since Donald Trump took office, trade tensions between US and China have been continuously rising. However, this time China isn't directly facing tariffs, but is still caught in the crossfires. According to Reuters, under an executive order by US President Donald Trump starting April 2nd, the US Secretary of State will have the authority to impose a 25% tariff on any country importing oil from Venezuela. It is well known that China is Venezuela's largest oil buyer, importing about 503,000 barrels of crude oil and fuel daily, either directly or indirectly accounting for about 55% of Venezuela's total exports. This means that starting on April 2nd, if China continues importing oil from Venezuela, it will face a 25% tariff from the US. Combined with the 20% tariff previously imposed by Trump, US tariffs on China will reach 65%, the figure Trump promised during his campaign. Trump's tariff sanctions on Venezuela could also potentially shift the global energy landscape, especially having a significant impact on China's energy supply. After the announcement of the tariff order, a spokesperson for the Chinese government quickly criticized the US.
The United States has long abused illegal unilateral sanctions and so-called long-arm jurisdiction, aggressively interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. China firmly opposes this. We call on the U.S. to stop interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs, to lift its illegal unilateral sanctions on Venezuela, and to do more to promote peaceful and stable development for Venezuela and other countries. There are no winners in a trade war or a tariff war. Increasing tariffs will only cause greater losses for U.S. businesses and consumers.
Apart from the Chinese government, Trump's sudden order has caught Chinese traders and refining companies off guard. Chinese oil traders and refiners have stated that they are waiting to see how the executive order is implemented and whether Beijing will order a halt to imports. A senior executive at a Chinese trading company that frequently deals with Venezuelan oil told Reuters that the company would suspend the purchase of shipments scheduled for April. He said the most concerning factors in the oil market is uncertainty. We are not daring to touch this batch of goods right now. Another trader mentioned that China's teapot refineries, a term referring to small independent refineries, have also suspended imports, awaiting further news on whether supplies will continue and how prices will fluctuate. It is reported that crude oil imported into China is often rerouted through Malaysia before entering the Chinese market, where it is processed by teapot refineries. These small independent refineries particularly prefer the cheaper, Mary heavy crude oil as it is more affordable than oil from Iran and Russia, which are under US sanctions. As the saying goes, business people prioritize profits, whether it's state-owned enterprises or local independent refineries. They all weigh the benefits and risk in a highly uncertain international environment. Venezuelan crude oil is cheap, but if the US does impose a 25% tariff or sanctions related to funding flows of shipping vessels, this deal could quickly become high risk. It is clear that America's punitive tariffs could plant a seed of uncertainty in the minds of all intermediaries and refiners. It is also worth noting that the Venezuelan government has long-standing debts with China. Through a trade company under the defense enterprise, the Chinese government imports about 52,000 barrels of Venezuelan crude oil daily to offset Venezuela's debt. In other words, this direct barter contract has been maintained for a long time. Normally, even when with turmoil, this oil for debt deal would continue. However, the current US executive order could disrupt this special channel. The US may pressure China by imposing sanctions or fines on the relevant oil vessels and intermediaries. Reports indicate that the stagnation of Venezuela's oil trade with China is not without cause. Before Trump's tariff order, the US had already targeted Chinese entities and vessels involved in oil trade operations. According to reports, this includes Shouguang Luqing Petrochemical, a Chinese local refinery known for purchasing cheap crude oil, particularly from Iran, as well as several ships that transport oil to China. Experts analyze that combined with recent US actions against the Chinese government, the US is sending political signals. To begin, let's examine the global energy landscape. For many years, the Chinese government has emphasized that it is not afraid of anyone on the international stage and will never submit to imperialist forces. However, in today's deeply interconnected global economy, it cannot isolate itself. In many key areas, China remains vulnerable. Huawei faced pressures from the US with restrictions on its semiconductor supply chain, while ZTE almost suffered a major blow due to supply disruptions. Now, China faces challenges related to oil supplies. The US has long been the world's largest producer and consumer of oil. However, in recent years, breakthroughs in shale oil and gas technology have reduced its reliance on external oil supplies. This shift has strengthened the US position in international politics, enabling it to take strong actions against countries like Iran and Venezuela without fearing negative consequences for itself. While China's oil and gas production has increased in recent years, it is still far from meeting its growing demand and cannot match the US and global oil pricing power. Especially during times of trade conflict between China and the US can leverage its financial and international influence to restrict China's energy supply. Oil is the lifeblood of industry, and when its flow is disrupted, the economic and social impact can be substantial. This is one of the reasons why China has been cautious about completely breaking ties with the US. On the other hand, the US is increasing its economic pressure on Chinese entities. The Trump administration's tariffs on oil imports from Venezuela also directly targets China's reliance on oil supplies, such as China's gray market operations, to circumvent sanctions. The US government believes that some Chinese companies and ships help countries like Venezuela and Iran bypass UN sanctions by transferring and relabeling oil through third countries. This not only undermines US authority in the global energy sanction system, but also provides critical funding for these sanctioned nations. However, these sanctions have also affected Chinese entities such as Shuoguang Luqing Petrochemical. The sanctions are another move by the US in the trade tensions and geopolitical struggles with China. The goal is to target certain parts of China's energy import chain, increasing the risk and uncertainties China faces in the international trade. For the US, this is not just a secondary strike against Venezuela and Iran, but also a broader effort to pressure China into adjusting its energy trade relations with these countries. However, these geopolitical and ideological factors ultimately impact private companies and ordinary consumers. For example, China's local and private refineries in Shandong and Liaoning are known for their flexibility and competitive nature. They survive in the market by purchasing cheaper heavy oil. If Venezuela's supply is cut off or costs rise significantly due to US tariffs, these refineries may face shrinking or even zero profit margins. Will these refineries switch to other problematic oil sources, such as oil from Iran, which carries sanctions risk, or will they be forced to follow official policies and purchase oil from more expensive sources? This could lead to mergers with larger state-owned enterprises. If the refining and chemical industries face instability, the consequences of unemployment and disruptions in the industrial chain could also be significant. It is also worth noting that after Trump's tariff order, there have also been some subtle shifts in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, which are deeply affected by the US-China trade tariffs, are balancing their economic cooperation with China while also aiming to avoid energy supply disruptions that could impact their industrial chains and market stability. With the interruption of Venezuela's oil trade and the uncertainty surrounding China's energy imports, some Asian countries are reconsidering their supply chain security and energy sources. In particular, Japanese companies have started adjusting the supply chain strategies. In recent years, many Japanese multinational companies have become deeply embedded in global supply chains, with China playing an important role. Trump's tariff order, which disrupted Venezuelan oil supplies, have increased the risk associated with upstream energy prices and supply. As a result, some companies have begun shifting production lines from China to Southeast Asia or increasing raw material reserves at home. The Japanese government is also actively coordinating with the US, the EU, and other countries to secure more stability for its businesses within the international trade system. This adjustment helps reduce potential risk while encouraging companies to further diversify their supply chain risk in a globalized environment. Germany, as a leader in European manufacturing, has a vast industrial system and a complex global supply chain. Some German companies have long relied on imported raw materials and energy from China when procuring intermediate products. Experts analyze that if China faces fluctuations in oil prices or supply shortages due to US tariffs and the interruption of Venezuelan oil supplies, German companies will need to reassess their supply chain risks. Experts suggest that India, as one of the world's emerging economies, has been working to enhance its industrial competitiveness in recent years. Facing US unilateral tariffs and the stagnation of oil trade between China and Venezuela, India is using this opportunity to further promote its Make in India strategy. The country is working to attract foreign investment while while accelerating the development of domestic energy independence. Some Indian companies have started discussions with energy suppliers from the Middle East and Africa aiming to diversify their energy sources. India is also using international multilateral platforms to seek cooperation with the EU and other countries to assess the impact of unilateral sanctions, aiming to secure more stable raw material supplies for its businesses. This strategy not only reduces dependency on a single energy supplier, but also strengthens India's negotiating position in international trade discussions. Will Beijing actually stop importing oil from Venezuela in the future? Given the current situation, many analysts believe it is unlikely that China will impose a complete ban on Venezuelan oil imports. The reasons are simple. First, China depends on foreign oil for over 70% of its needs, and Venezuela is one of the most stable and cost-effective sources, with few viable alternatives. Second, Chinese refineries, including private ones, have developed processing techniques for very heavy crude oil. Cutting off its supply would not only result in short-term economic disruptions, but would also lead to long-term technical and production waste. Currently, Chinese buyers are mostly waiting and observing, fearing the details of how the tariffs will be enforced once they take effect on April 2nd. While these buyers are not likely to pull out completely, the scale of transaction is expected to shrink and prices may be impacted. In the long term, if the US and Europe continue to escalate their scrutiny and sanctions on the Venezuela-China oil trade, more and more Chinese companies will likely hesitate to engage in this business, ultimately abandoning Venezuelan oil imports. At that point, the Maduro government would lose its most important export market, and Venezuela's economy would likely continue to weaken. Meanwhile, China would have to urgently seek other cheap energy sources and deal with the greater economic risk brought about by deteriorating relations with the US. Some experts argue that Venezuela is simply a pawn in the US border strategy to target China's energy supply. In other words, the US goal is to use its pressure on Venezuela to intimidate China and increase the pressure on its energy imports. The US is likely to continue using sanctions to limit Iran's oil sales to China. After all, Iran oil exports have long been a target for US sanctions, and the US may further tighten Iran's access to global markets, making it more difficult for China to secure oil from Iran. At the same time, the US may collaborate with more allies to block Russian energy exports. Russia is one of the world's major energy suppliers, with its oil and natural gas export holding a significant position in the global market. If the US joins forces with Europe or other countries to take action blocking or restricting Russia's energy exports, it would not only affect Russia's economy, but also make it more difficult for China to secure sufficient resources in the global energy market. In short, the US is working through multiple layers of pressure, aiming to create more uncertainty and risk in the global energy market, forcing China to find alternative energy sources. This also applies both economic and political pressures on China. The reason why China is in this difficult situation is, according to some analysts, tied to its governance model. China insists on a highly centralized domestic government while partially opening its economy to profit from global markets. Diplomatically, it seeks to maintain a delicate relationship with the US while refusing to abandon energy purchases from supposed allies like Iran and Venezuela in order to maintain influence in the developing world. These contradictions are accumulating, and once one fragile link faces external pressure, the entire structure may crack. Some commentators have also mocked the Chinese government for continuing to make empty promises, trying to cover up its awkward situation abroad. This may lead to an increasing gap between what is said and the actual situation, which over time could undermine its political legitimacy. Meanwhile, caught between the intense US-China standoff and the Venezuelan oil crisis, it is often the ordinary businesses and citizens who suffer. They rely on a stable economic environment and smooth supply chains to get by. If factories stop, production lines break down, or raw materials prices surge, these businesses will face difficulties, triggering a chain reaction. After all, once China's economy is impacted, the factory shutdowns and reduced orders, the quality of life and income levels of Chinese ordinary citizens will sharply decline. This will likely lead to growing public discontent and pose a risk to social stability.